Hey everyone, it is Jaime Jo Wright here, and I'm super excited because I have a good friend with me again today, Ruth Douthitt. Hey Ruth, how's it
Hey,
going?
good morning. I'm fine. Tired, but fine.
I know we were both just before we hit record discussing the chaos of a Friday and
Yes. Life, and lack of coffee. I need to go get more caffeine.
right. Yeah, you should have brought a cup of coffee,
I
but
know.
we'll make this a really fast podcast. We'll like 5 minute
Okay.
it so you get your coffee. Oh, fun. So, well, Ruth, you have released a plethora of books. But I've had you on before here when we talked about The Doors of Rome, which
Yay.
was one of your releases just recently. And now we have a follow-up book called The Windows of Venice.
Yeah.
And so tell us a
So
little bit
excited.
about that. I'm so
Oh, I'm so
excited.
excited. Well, you know how it is when you write a series, there's a character in the book, and you just think, I want to write something for that character. So
Mhm,
in The Doors of Rome, there's a character named Joy, and unfortunately, she received some bad news from her husband that he was leaving her for a younger woman. And
mhm.
so she and her daughter had their adventure in Rome in that book. And so for The Windows of Venice, it follows Joy. Her daughter met the love of her life in Rome, and they are getting married and headed back home. But Joy decided to head off to Venice on her own for her own adventures to
Mhm.
kind of heal her heart. And so as she gets there, she discovers more about herself than she thought, as you know, you always
Mhm.
do, especially when you travel alone. And so she runs into a couple of florists and helps them set up for a wedding reception, and they ask her to work for them part time. So she decides to take the job and just see how it works out for a couple of weeks.
Mhm.
And she's such a loyal person and a giver that she wants to help them. But her daughter back home says, Mom, you're supposed to come home and help me with this wedding. What are you doing? You're putting
Oops.
others, right? You're putting others ahead of us again, like you always do. What are you doing?
Mhm.
So Joy lets her know, don't worry, I will come back. I will be there for
Yeah.
your wedding.
Yeah.
But she meets a man named Alessandro, a local flower delivery guy, and they start to have a romance, even
Mhm.
though she swears, I'm not in Venice for romance. Well, Venice, you just can't help but feel
I was like,
romantic.
who go? What? Why else would
Yeah,
you go to Venice? I mean,
right, exactly. So she's delusional. So she meets Alessandro, and right as their romance begins, her ex husband Tony shows up to woo
mm,
her back. So now she has a choice to make. Does she
mhm.
start again with Alessandro, or does she try and rekindle the romantic feelings with Tony, whose new wife just left him?
Oh,
So it's about,
yeah.
being resilient and
Mhm.
second chances. And it's
Mhm.
just about a woman, an older woman, over 50, trying to
Mhm.
find herself and her
Yeah.
purpose.
Yeah.
So that's my story. And I really had fun delving into Joy's feelings and emotions. And as a mother, you
Mm.
really want to provide everything for your child. And she wants to give her daughter a family again at
Yeah.
the wedding. She wants her dad and mom to be there.
Mhm.
And so she's really torn. Should she start something new with Alessandra, or head home with her ex husband, Tony, and try and start again to rebuild a family?
Yeah.
So far, the reviews coming in are a lot of women who said, I could relate to Joy.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, my heart has been broken like that too.
Yeah.
And I have a tendency to put my children first ahead of myself, and a lot of others, ahead of myself. So they
Yes.
really connected with Joy,
Yeah.
and at that time in her life.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
Mm.
there's several unique things about this book. I mean, the first one being you do have a primary character who's over 50,
Yeah.
which it shouldn't be unique. We should have more
Yeah.
fiction out
Right.
there for that
I
age
know.
group because it's not like life stops after you turn 30.
Exactly. And a lot of people think life stops at 50.
Yeah. Yeah.
And no, it doesn't. Doors of Rome followed older
Mhm.
women, and now
Mhm.
Windows of Venice does. So it's kind of like Mrs. Harris Goes to Paris, where
Yeah.
it's women's adventure fiction, where
Mhm.
you're going someplace that maybe you've never been before. You
Mhm.
feel like you're there, and you're having this adventure with the character, but also learning that there are still challenges, there's still opportunities for growth at that
Right.
age. Don't give
Right.
up.
Right. Right. Yeah. And you can still dream and there's
Yes.
so much life left to be lived. It's not like you're on the way to the grave.
Right.
I think that's how it used to be back in the olden
Yes.
days, right? Where
Because
50 really was old.
we watched that movie Deep Impact. I don't know if you ever saw it, with Elijah Wood,
Yeah.
and they find this asteroid. Well,
Yeah.
you remember, as the asteroid's coming, they create this plan to put everybody in a cave, like a million people in a cave. And the cutoff age was 50. Anybody over 50 couldn't go in. I just went, what? I looked at my husband and I said, do you remember hearing that when we first saw this movie? 50 is the cutoff? Are you kidding me? So, I mean, Hollywood felt like after 50, that's it. You've got nothing to contribute, so you are out of there.
Right.
And I thought,
I think Hollywood would even up it now too, that so many of their stars are well over 50.
Right.
But,
and making movies and winning awards.
Who wants to kill off Harrison Ford in an asteroid?
Or Robert Downey Jr.
Right.
Right.
And these people deserve a spot in the cave.
Yes. But I could not believe. I thought, when did this movie come out? Like 30 years ago or something like that? And they're saying 50. You have nothing to contribute to society. Yes. You're out of there. And I thought, oh my gosh. So things have changed. Thank the Lord, things have changed. And folks like me and my husband would be considered, worthy of living.
I'd still be able to squeak in, but just barely, right? I'm squeaking in by the skin of my teeth into this cave.
Too funny.
Oh, funny. But no, I think it is neat to have fiction that's adventurous, romantic, and those types of things. But I think the other thing that's unique about this book is in Christian fiction, typically if you have someone who's gone through a troubled marriage, there's some sort of spiritual redemption and renewal, and the marriage returns, or the spouse has done something so ridiculously awful it feels like the marriage ending is very justified, which I understand from a biblical concept. As Christians, we want to make sure we fit everything into a nice little neat glove, but that's not how life works either.
Not always. That's right.
No. So I think it's neat that you've tackled such a topic such as troubled marriages that are over and then restarting, and the dynamics between an ex coming into a picture and then someone who maybe is the redemption, and it may not be the ex, and how does that work? So what gave you the courage to go there, Ruth?
Well, unfortunately it was my mom's story that inspired me. Unfortunately, my parents divorced when I was a little kid because of my father leaving, and my mom was suddenly a single mom with 4 children. Well, my dad came back, and she gave him an ultimatum. She said, you're going to get counseling with me, with this pastor that I'm meeting with. And to her shock, my dad said, okay. So they got counseling. They both received Christ as their savior and were baptized, and all of us kids were baptized. So that was kind of a neat rekindling, a second chance. But unfortunately, when I was 15, they divorced again. And that seemed like it was final. It was forever. Sure. Well, then when I was in college, my dad came back around. And this time, my sister and I, we were just so angry that my mom would take him back, because we loved how independent she became. She was living on her own, finding her own self, becoming the strong woman of resilience. And we loved that for her. And then for her to go back to my dad meant that she would regress back into that, I'm taking care of him, forget about me. It's all about him, all about the kids. We didn't want her to go back into that pattern. And unfortunately, she did. So this book was kind of written for those ladies who feel like once you're married and a mother, you lose yourself, and it's all about them. You set yourself aside, and it's all about making their dreams come true. And Joy had to come to that realization that, her ex-husband's back, but he needs to know what her dreams are now. So she's going to tell him for the first time that this is what I want to do with my life. What do you think? Because I didn't tell you that before. And I think that may have made you think I'm boring and dull and start looking elsewhere. And so he listens to her dreams and, is convinced that maybe it's time for them to work together rather than, it's all about me. It's all about the husband, his career. So Joy has that realization that when you're married doesn't necessarily mean the wife has to give herself up.
Right.
And her daughter helps her process through that too. So could they come back together and rebuild what had been severed? We'll find out. But I think now that Joy has found herself, and that happened a lot in the doors of Rome, she found herself there. And then now in Venice, she's realizing who Joy is. She's going all the way back to before kids, before marriage. And what were her dreams? What did she want to do? What was her purpose in life? And she's tapping into that again. So I that's kind of the message I want readers to take away. And that's kind of why I wrote the book. Unfortunately, my mom is in heaven now. She's not around to read the book, but it was kind of for her, for the women out there of that generation, I think, and who kind of thought, well, once you're married, once you become a mom, you set yourself aside and that's it. Right. Yeah. So that was the inspiration for it.
And that's a difficult balance to have, really.
Yeah,
you know, when you have children, obviously you have to make them a priority, and marriage too is kind of a yin and a yang, and a give and a take, and a back and forth. So finding that balance is super difficult.
It is, and you have to communicate that right at the start. We'll be celebrating our 36th wedding anniversary next week. And I just happened to mention that in a meeting the other day. And one of the ladies in the meeting said, well, you know, I'm going to ask next, right? And I said, oh, how old we were? Yeah, we were 21. She says, no. I was going to ask you, what's your advice? What's your marriage advice? How do you make a marriage last that long? And I just laughed and I said, oh my gosh, I've never been asked that. And the first thing that came to mind was communication, you know, right up front, and about children, about how you're going to raise them, about helping each other. You know, what goals do you have? What are your long-term goals, your short-term goals? And the next thing was make sure that a woman understands she's responsible for her own happiness. When we first got married, I thought my husband was responsible for making me happy. And he thought that too, right?
Sure.
After a couple of years, we both realized, no, that's not how it works. I told him, I'm responsible for my own happiness and you're responsible for yours. But what I loved about my husband is once I started to let him know what my dreams were, what my goals were about being an author and an artist, and all these wacky running goals I had, like, I'm going to run a marathon in Rome. You know, I mean, he came alongside me. Yeah, right. He's like, let's go. When do we leave?
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
He's always been there to come alongside me and to support me and make my dreams come true, help me reach my goals, removing as many obstacles as he can. And when I get down in the dumps and I feel like a failure, he's always there to remind me, you know, remember why you wanted to do this in the first place. Remember how God has come through for us so many times. So that's like my marriage advice to people is communicate, get those goals explained, you know, right up front, and help each other reach those goals, help each other overcome those obstacles, you know?
Yeah.
And that's what's helped for us all these years. So, and I think my son, now he's 29, I think growing up, he realized mom is mom and she's my dad's wife, but she's also this artist and this author and this runner and a teacher. You know, she does all these other things too. Yeah. She's not just mom or dad's wife, you know? Right. So I asked him about that recently and he said, yeah, I think it's really neat. He goes, I think it's neat how you create all these projects for yourself. Like another coloring book or another marathon. Right. He goes, I really like that about you. And I said, well, I want you to see that your wife in the future, she's going to have all these things that she wants to accomplish too. Right. So keep that in mind. Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting. I'm reading a book right now about a woman. Her name was Elizabeth Packard, and she lived in the 1860s. So, I mean, it's an older story, but very historical. But it was back in the days when men had the ability to deem their wives insane and have them committed to institutions purely based on the word of the husband. And this woman, Elizabeth Packard, I'm not through the book yet, but from what I understand and where it's going, she helped to revolutionize the laws so that the husbands didn't necessarily have that extreme power. But just listening to her story, her dreams were so simple. She wanted to be home with her children. She wanted to lead prayer and Bible study. for a group of people. But the more she did things like that, the more independent her mind became and the more of a
See.
threat that became to her husband. So he ended up having her committed. And her story of her time in the institution and all of that is just, it's extremely fascinating. But you look at the concepts of the patriarchy as we go through, and the mix-up, I would dare to say, of the misinterpretation of scripture as it relates.
Ephesians 5.
As it relates, women submit to your husbands, and then we have a period there. And my husband has always been like, there's not a period there.
That's right.
Wives submit to your husbands, and husbands love your wives as
Christ.
Church.
Yeah, that's right.
And so when you think about it, you're like, oh, well, how did Christ love the church? And you're like, okay, well, he was kind of like brutally murdered. I mean, if you want to throw it out there, he was brutally murdered. It was crucifixion, torturous, but he did it for the sake of the one he loved, for his bride.
He gave up everything.
It was completely heroic. And I've always looked at my husband and gone, if that's a high standard to live up to. So one, I kind of feel a little bit bad for you, honey.
Yes, exactly.
But on the flip side,
right?
I have no problem when the time comes of submitting to his leadership, because 90% of the time, I'll give him room to be human, but 90% of the time, his leadership or his laying down of the law is heavily influenced by what I want or my needs or my desires. And so that submission isn't a domination. It becomes a submitting to somebody who's basically handing you a treasure and saying, here, I want to lift you up as my bride, as my wife, as the one that I love, versus that old fashioned, I'm going to institutionalize you if you have a mind.
Right. I didn't like the way you washed this dish. You're out of here.
How dare you have a
right?
thought.
And that's really how it was back then. They couldn't go to college. They couldn't get divorced. They couldn't get a job without their husband's permission. And you're so right. I mean, for years, I think for the first 10 years of our marriage, I rarely prayed for my husband at all. When I started to pray for him, very specifically, for wisdom, spiritual leadership, financial savvy, all that stuff, his physical health, everything. It changed our marriage, changed the way I looked at him. But the thing that he worked on was before he had to make these big decisions, he would go get wise Christian counsel from these other godly men. And then he would commit it to prayer and then make the decision. And when he told me all that, I went and talked to so-and-so. I've been praying about it, and this is what I think. That gave me such peace. Yeah. So I thought, okay, he's not going by emotions. He's not going by his selfish wants. He's not going by anything else except godly, spiritual advice and prayer. Okay, so that made it easier for me to submit. And that's, I think, what Jesus was saying when he said, you have to come to the kingdom like a little child, totally dependent on the Father. Yeah. And when a husband shows his wife, I am totally dependent on the Father for this decision, for this, thing that's going to impact you and the kids. That gives us peace because we're like, okay, Jesus is in this too. Great. Okay, awesome. I can submit to that. Right. So, but you're right. They have this tremendous burden on their shoulders of dying to self all the time, dying to themselves to make their wives' dreams come true, to help their kids. Yeah. It's beautiful if you think of it that way. It really
is. And I firmly believe that's how the Lord intended it to be. And so that word submission becomes so much less offensive than the way that I think in general, we as women tend to hear. We look at it through the lives of Elizabeth Packard, like, I'm going to be institutionalized for having a thought. And so it's so important.
And it sort of happened to my mom too. And she was 16. She was so beautiful. And I think her mom, my Nana, was threatened by her. And so she had her put in a convent against my mom's wishes.
Really?
She just packed her up, put her in a convent. And ironically, my mom used to tell me, believe it or not, I loved it there. She goes, I wanted to become a nun. She goes, I just fell in love with it. And and so that kind of made my Nana go, it didn't have the impact that I thought it did. So she pulled her out of there and said, you're going to school. Yeah. So she pulled her out of there.
You dare become a nun.
Right. It's like, no, you're not going to, you can't enjoy it. It's supposed to be torture, So then, yeah, so my mom said it kind of backfired because I loved it in there. And so
Yeah.
it's kind of sad when women back then just
Yeah.
didn't have a voice.
No,
So, yeah.
no. And so as that translates back into your book, The Windows of Venice, we're kind of coming full circle though. I mean, you do.
Yeah.
You have a woman who's struggling to find her own voice and she's in her 50s. And I do think sometimes it takes decades for a woman to find that freedom in her relationship with the Lord, in her marriage, in her relationships with others, however you want to spin it, to find what does have intended for my life. And what are his dreams that he's planted in my heart. And so that's cool. But let's talk about Venice.
Ooh,
because
let's
we're
go
kind of
there. Let's go there.
In the world, room. I mean, yeah. We've solved the patriarchy, and I think we've solved the whole question of dominance in marriage. So let's go to Italy and go to Venice. Been there, done that. Love Venice.
Oh,
I know you just got back from there, so
yes. So my brain is still there.
Yes,
but I mean, we hadn't been on a vacation in 3 years, so my husband's been saving up. He said, "Where do you want to go?" And this was like back in January. I said, "Well, maybe a cruise. Let's do a cruise." So I was looking at some options, but I knew I had to finish this book to get it to my editor. And I was writing it. It was coming along, but the descriptions were tough. I was looking at videos and Google Maps, all that stuff to feel like I was there. But I thought, you know what? I think we need to go to Venice so I can finish this book. Yeah. And so when I told my husband, he said, "Okay, start looking at, packages and stuff." So it all fell together so easily. And when we got there, it was nighttime.
Okay.
I had joined a couple of Facebook groups asking them advice. And I said, "Well, we're arriving at night. What can we expect?" And everybody was like, "Oh, I envy you. It's so beautiful at night. You're going to love it." So when we got on the water taxi and the boat was arriving, they were so right. It was 65 degrees and beautiful. You could hear the seagulls and you could see the city lit up as we approached. And as we came around through the lagoon, and we saw the city and the architecture and the famous towers, and I was just in love immediately.
Yeah.
I just said, "Okay, I'm so glad we did this."
Yep.
So I got everything I needed for the book, but then also, the romance with my husband, the adventure, we walked everywhere. We got in about 17,000 steps a day.
I believe it.
Yep. And so it's like the Lord gave me the metaphor too, in that, as you know, with Venice, it's 100 islands connected by 400 bridges, and there's all these alleyways. And that's kind of like the Christian walk. You're going through these alleys, you're walking, they're narrow, you think you know where you're going, and you turn a corner and bling, there's this piazza with trees and people and cafes, and you're just like, wow, and the architecture. And that's kind of how the Christian walk is. You think you know where you're going. It's narrow sometimes. You might be passing a few people. You might feel alone and claustrophobic because, but then the Lord has you turn a corner and it's amazing. He gives you this amazing experience and view and you're on your way. And it was just like refreshing to see that, to experience that. And you cross these beautiful, quaint bridges that have this history, and you take a gondola ride and you learn more about the history and the water, the smell of the ocean, and of course the food. Don't get me started on the food.
Oh, but well, that's an experience in itself.
Right? Oh, yeah. So there were no regrets, but I could definitely go back time and time again because there's still so much to see. But I just kept thanking the Lord. We'd look at a beautiful view and I'd say, "Thank you, Lord, for this gift." Because it was from him. Absolutely. Yeah. So I got all the descriptions and emotions for my book after, visiting and coming back and finishing the book, getting it to my editor. And my beta readers loved it, loved the descriptions. They said, "Just like you do with Doors of Rome, we feel like we're there walking around." I said, "Yay, that's what I wanted to accomplish." So I just feel like the Lord answered my prayer and gave me this story and gave me Venice as a nice little gift. So
well, Venice is gorgeous. I remember being there myself, and I spent about an hour and a half just sitting in St. Mark's Square with pigeons. Just alone. I was just on the steps, and I was just sitting there, just drinking in the ambiance of it. And it's just it's a different life, and it's just a different feeling that's really hard to explain if you haven't been there.
It's just slow, Italy is just slow and relaxed, and that's what we did too. We just sat and watched the boats,
Mm-hmm.
sat and
Mm-hmm.
listened to the water. So refreshing. So
Yeah,
refreshing.
absolutely. All right. Well, the book Windows in Venice comes out very soon.
Yay!
And if you want to read the precursor, you can. It's not required, but you can read The Doors of Rome, which is available now. And then and then you can go to Venice. So Rome, Venice. I mean, I think next up is Tuscany.
Florence and Tuscany. Yep. Now we've been to Florence, but I told my husband we didn't go to Tuscany, so I might need to go.
There you go.
He's like, well, I don't know if I could do that long trip again. So I turned to my son. I said, "Would you go with me?" He goes, "Absolutely." So it might be a mother-son trip next time.
There you go. There you go. And if worse comes to worse and you're out of options, just give me a call.
I'll call you. Yeah.
Sure.
So yeah,
Jaime and Ruth in Tuscany. That would be an adventure.
Absolutely.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being on the podcast. And if readers want to find out more about you and all your books and everything, where would be the best place for them to go?
My website, artbyruth.com, where you can learn more about me, my books, and my art.
Mm-hmm.
And you can sign up for my newsletter, and I give away a free coloring book if you do a fantasy art coloring book, because I've got one of those coming out later this year too.
Yes.
And so you'll see all the various books that I write, but you'll see more about the Windows of Venice there and the Doors of Rome. Mm-hmm. So visit me at artbyruth.com.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Ruth, so much for being here today.
Thank you, Jaime.